Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. You know what? Let's start this today with something I probably don't say often enough when I'm talking about MAGA. A good many of these people are pissed off for perfectly legitimate reasons. Seriously. Have you tried buying a house lately? Have you gone grocery shopping? Have you priced health insurance, car insurance, homeowners insurance? Have you watched your electric bill climb, your rent climb, your deductible climb, your paycheck does that neat little trick where technically the number gets bigger, but somehow you don't feel any richer? There are millions of Americans looking at their lives right now and saying to themselves, something about this does not work. And on that, I agree with them. I think something doesn't work. I think it is entirely reasonable for a 30-year-old who has a decent job and still can't afford a starter home to be pissed off. I think it is reasonable for somebody working 35 hours a week without health insurance to wonder what happened to the bargain where work was supposed to provide some security. I think it's reasonable for parents to look at schools struggling with absenteeism and behavior problems and teacher shortages and kids falling behind and demand answers. I think it's reasonable to care about crime. I think it's reasonable to look at what you pay for healthcare in the richest country on earth and say, are you freaking kidding me? So this is not going to be one of those episodes where the progressive guy behind the microphone spends 50 minutes or so telling conservatives that everything is actually wonderful and they're just too stupid to appreciate it. No. The pain is real. The anxiety and the frustration are real. And that is precisely why the next question matters so much. Who deserves the blame? Because if you spend any time in MAGA politics or watching conservative media, you have probably been given a pretty extensive suspect list. Immigrants, transgender people, DEI, teachers, Muslims, welfare recipients, college professors, gay people, women exercising body autonomy, somebody somewhere speaking Spanish. There's always somebody. And what I want to do today is something a little different. I want to take the anger seriously. I want to take the problem seriously. And believe it or not, I even want to take some of the conservative explanations seriously because sometimes they have a point. Immigration can affect housing demand. Government spending can contribute to inflation. Regulations can raise costs. Globalization really did gut some American communities. Bad local policies can really make things worse. We're not going to bullshit our way around those facts just because they're inconvenient. But we're also not going to stop there. We're going to keep pulling the thread. How much does that actually explain? What else is happening? Who had the power to make the decision? Who wrote the rules? Who benefits from the arrangement? And who benefits when you're looking somewhere else? Because I think one of the most successful political tricks in the modern American right has been built on a very simple idea. You don't have to convince people that they aren't hurting. You just have to convince them they're hurting because of the wrong people. The lie isn't that you're hurting. The lie is who you've been told to blame. neighbors, and happy Monday, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're doing a reality check. Not the kind where I pull up 6 ridiculous Donald Trump quotes and spend an hour saying, no, bullshit, no, also bullshit. This one's bigger than that. We're going to look at 6 things Americans have every right to be concerned about: the cost of living, housing, jobs, and wages, healthcare, education, and crime. And with each one, we're going to ask essentially the same question. What is the actual problem? What does MAGA tell you caused it? And what does the evidence say? And once we understand that, who actually has the power to change it and who benefits when your anger gets pointed somewhere else? No straw man, no pretending every CEO spends his evenings stroking a white cat and plotting against the working class. No pretending every conservative argument is nonsense just because a conservative made the argument. I want to follow the evidence, and then we're going to follow the power. Let's start with the thing you probably notice every day or every time you pull out your wallet. Why does everything cost so damn much? This should be the easiest one, because you don't need an economist to tell you that things cost more. You know. I recently saw a quote from the president where he talked about people think that there's an affordability crisis because the news tells them that. That's not how I know. I know because I buy groceries and I pay the electric bill and I insure my car, and I go out to dinner and wonder when a cheeseburger became a financing decision. And here's where Democrats have sometimes done themselves absolutely no favors. Because when inflation started coming down after the post-pandemic surge, there was this tendency to point at the inflation rate and say, see, inflation is down. Okay. But that does not mean prices are down. Those are completely different things. And I think a lot of people confuse them. If something costs $100 and inflation is 8%, now it costs $108. If inflation falls to 3%, next year, congratulations, inflation came down, and now your $108 thing costs more than $111. That's why somebody can hear a politician bragging that inflation has fallen and think, well, then why is my grocery bill still so high? Because lower inflation generally means prices are rising more slowly. It doesn't mean somebody hit rewind. As of July, consumer prices were still 3.4% higher than they were the year earlier. Food was up 3%, electricity up a little over 4%. Energy overall was up almost 15%, driven heavily by gasoline. So yes, if you feel squeezed, you're not imagining it. No matter how much someone may tell you that you are. Now comes the diagnosis. If you listen to the right, depending on the day, this is Biden's fault, or immigrants' fault, environmental regulations' fault, government spending's fault, or some combination of all 4. And here's where we're going to establish a rule for the episode. I'm not going to tell you that all of that is nonsense, because it isn't. Massive government spending can add to an economy, can add demand to an economy and contribute to inflation. Energy shocks absolutely affect prices. Regulations can raise costs. And if demand for goods and services grows faster than the economy can supply them, prices tend to rise. Fine. Score 1 for reality. But if somebody tells you that that's the whole story, now we're in trouble. Because what happened to prices over the last several years was a pileup. COVID shut factories and clogged ports and disrupted supply chains and changed what people were buying almost overnight. Consumers suddenly shifted enormous amounts of spending from services towards goods. Then demand came roaring back. Labor markets tightened. Russia's invasion of Ukraine produced another global energy and commodity shock. Housing costs surged. And then, more recently, we added another inflationary pressure that somehow gets less airtime on conservative television. Tariffs. Federal Reserve's July report to Congress specifically said tariff increases had pushed up domestic prices on some imported goods. And this year, the Fed says inflation also got another kick from the energy shock tied to the Iran conflict. That's the thing about inflation. It's boringly complicated. There isn't one guy standing behind the meat counter with the giant red button marked raise prices. And while we're here, let me annoy a few people on my own side too. I don't think corporate greed is the complete explanation either. Corporations were greedy in 2019. They didn't wake up during COVID and discover money. The better question is when businesses have the power to raise prices and preserve larger margins. If you're competing against 15 other companies selling basically the same product, you're raising your prices too much can cost you customers. If your industry has consolidated down to 3 or 4 giants, then that's a different ballgame. Competition matters, market concentration matters, and supply constraints matter. And corporate pricing behavior can matter without requiring us to pretend every increase on a supermarket shelf was somebody twirling a mustache in a boardroom. That's what I mean by following the mechanism. And here's where the political misdirection starts getting interesting, because imagine you're paying substantially more to feed your family. You are justified to be angry. But where does that anger go? Toward the immigrant working in the processing plant, towards somebody receiving SNAP benefits, toward whatever vulnerable group appeared in the Chiron on Fox News that afternoon? Or do we ask harder questions? How competitive is the industry? What happened to the supply chain? What are tariffs adding to the cost? What happened to energy prices? What government policies increased demand? Where did companies gain their pricing power? What could antitrust enforcement actually change? Those answers won't fit on a bumper sticker, but they have one enormous advantage over a bumper sticker. They're much closer to reality. And if there's one expense where all of these questions, supply and demand and regulation, investment, immigration, interest rates, politics, all collide in a spectacular fashion, it's the roof over your head. If you are in your 20s or 30s right now, maybe making decent money, maybe doing everything you were told you were supposed to do, buying a house can feel less like a milestone and more like somebody handed you a menu from a restaurant that you can't afford to eat at. And there are really 2 separate problems happening at once. First, home prices went through the roof. According to the Congressional Budget Office, from 2020 through 2023, home prices rose an average of more than 10% a year. Not total, per year. And CBO says that happened because demand for homes increased while the inventory of existing homes for sale remained limited. Then came the second punch. Mortgage rates rose. So even after home price growth cooled, the monthly payment on the house you were trying to buy became dramatically more expensive. Higher price, higher borrowing cost, same paycheck. Good luck. So when somebody says we have a housing affordability crisis, yes, absolutely. Now let's talk about the MAGA explanation, because immigration has become one of the favorite answers. Too many immigrants. They're taking apartments. They're driving up rents. They're adding demand to a housing market that already doesn't have enough homes. And here's where some people on the left get themselves into trouble by responding with, that's racist. Immigration has nothing to do with housing. And no, that's too easy, and it isn't true. The Congressional Budget Office has looked at this specifically, and they say the immigration surge that began earlier this decade did increase demand for housing. It increased household formation. And because you cannot build apartments and houses instantly, that additional demand initially worsens a housing shortage. CBO also says the effects can be larger in places where zoning and land use restrictions or geography make it difficult to build additional housing. So there you go. On this part, they have a point. More people need more places to live. It's not advanced astrophysics, but now comes the question we're going to keep asking today. How much does that actually explain? Because CBO did not say America had an affordable housing market until immigrants showed up and ruined it. What CBO describes is additional demand being dumped into a market that already has a serious supply problem. And that's a big distinction. It matters. If 10 people are fighting over 8 houses, adding another person makes the competition worse. Of course it does. But you still have to ask why you only built 8 houses. And suddenly the explanation gets a hell of a lot less convenient politically. We have places where zoning makes it extraordinarily difficult to build anything denser than a single family house. Places where residents show up at public meetings demanding that somebody solve the housing shortage as long as nobody builds the solution anywhere near their house. There used to be a very popular acronym, NIMBY, not in my backyard. George Carlin did a great piece on it. You should look it up. But we have other things. We have permitting delays. We have land costs. We have construction costs, interest rates, supply shortages. And we have what economists sometimes call the lock-in effect. Millions of existing homeowners refinanced or bought when mortgage rates were incredibly low. Now imagine you've got a 3% mortgage. Are you eager to sell that house and replace it with another mortgage at twice the rate? Probably not. So people stay put. That means fewer existing houses hit the market, and fewer houses for sale means more competition for the ones that do. CBO still describes the scarcity of existing homes for sale as a major factor affecting the housing market in 2026. Then we get to institutional investors, because that gets blamed too. And again, there's something real there. Large investors buying houses can absolutely affect certain local markets, especially places where they own meaningful shares of lower price single family housing. But institutional investors are not buying every house in America. Their importance varies by region. So once again, real factor, but not a magic explanation. And underneath all of this is a contradiction that American politicians don't like talking about very much. We say we want housing to be affordable, but we also tell homeowners that their house is an investment, your nest egg, your wealth, something that should appreciate year after year. Well, those are not always compatible goals. If you're 65 years old and you've spent 30 years paying off your house, you probably don't want somebody in Washington announcing, good news, we figured out housing affordability. Your $400,000 house is now worth $280,000. You're going to have to answer some questions. But if you're 28 and you're trying to buy that same house, you might think that sounds pretty darn good. The thing that represents wealth to one person represents an impossible price tag to another. And Donald Trump did something remarkable early this year. He basically said the quiet part out loud. This clip is from a cabinet meeting in January.
We're going to keep those prices up. We're not going to destroy the value of their homes so that somebody that didn't work very hard can buy a home.
There it is. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to pretend that Trump said something he didn't. He's talking about protecting existing homeowners. And that is a legitimate political concern. For millions of people, their house is the biggest asset they own. A housing crash can wipe out enormous amounts of household wealth. We learned that dramatically in 2008, but listen to the contradiction. You have a generation of young people saying, we can't afford these houses. And the president saying, I don't want the prices of those houses to go down. Those two sentences cannot simply be wished into harmony. Trump's position has been explicit. He wants existing homeowners to retain the value of their properties. The Associated Press reported on the tension earlier this year, noting that this goal runs directly into the affordability problem that is confronting, first-time homebuyers and younger homebuyers. So when MAGA tells that 28-year-old, you can't buy a house because immigrants drove up the price, okay, immigration added some housing demand. We established that, but don't stop there. Ask why America did not build enough housing to absorb population growth. Ask why zoning makes construction so difficult in many places. Ask why existing homeowners often oppose new development that might reduce scarcity. Ask what interest rates did to monthly payments. Ask what investors are doing to the markets where they have a significant presence. And then ask why the political leader promising you affordable housing is also publicly promising the person who already owns the house that he doesn't want prices to fall. That's the reality check. The immigrant isn't imaginary. The additional demand isn't imaginary, but neither is the rest of the equation. And when somebody hands you one convenient villain for a problem this complicated, maybe don't stop asking questions just because the answer makes a good campaign commercial. Because maybe you finally find a house you can afford. Maybe you somehow scrape together the down payment. Maybe you make the monthly payment work. And maybe you're thinking, all right, at least if I work hard enough, eventually my paycheck catches up. Right? Yeah, about that. Let's talk about work, because one of the easiest political tricks in America is to point at the unemployment rate and act like that number tells you everything you need to know about whether people are doing okay. It does not. You can have a job and still be struggling. You can have two jobs and still be struggling. You can be working full time and still be one broken transmission away from financial crisis. And you can technically be earning more money than you were a year ago while still losing ground after inflation. As of July, real average hourly earnings, that means wages adjusted for inflation, were actually down 0.2% from a year earlier. That's not catastrophic, but certainly not the picture of workers racing ahead. And there's another number I think tells an even bigger story. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks what it calls the labor share. Basically, of all the economic output being produced, how much is going to workers in compensation? And in the second quarter of this year, that share fell to 52.9%. That was the lowest level in the entire BLS series, which goes all the way back to 1947. Think about that. The economy can become more productive. Companies can produce more. Technology can improve. Profits can rise. The stock market can soar. And none of that automatically means the worker producing that value gets a proportional share of it. That's the difference between asking, are there jobs, and asking, what kind of jobs are they? Now, the MAGA answer to economic insecurity is usually some combination of immigration, China, globalization, environmental regulation, taxes, and lately a DEI coordinator hiding in the midst. And once again, I'm not throwing all of that in the garbage. Globalization absolutely hurt some American companies, and factories closed and jobs moved overseas. Entire towns built around one manufacturer got hollowed out. If you were a machinist in a town where the plant shut down and production moved halfway around the world, I'm not going to sit here and explain that globalization was secretly fantastic for you because televisions got cheaper. Your job disappeared. That's real. Automation eliminated jobs too. Immigration can affect particular labor markets. Environmental policy can impose transition costs on workers in industries being phased down. Fine. But again, you need to keep going because American workers have also spent decades dealing with things like declining union power, outsourcing, consolidation, automation, employers gaining greater leverage over labor, and corporate structures that reward executives and shareholders very differently from the people clocking in every morning. And then there's the little phrase that makes all of this disappear. Just get a job. You hear versions of this constantly. You want health insurance? You need to get a job. You want stability? Get a job. You want to stop relying on the government? Get a job. Okay. What job? And what does that job actually provide? Because there is this bizarre assumption in American political rhetoric that somewhere around your first day of employment, a little benefits fairy appears and hands you health insurance and paid vacation and sick leave and a retirement plan and a gold watch. And that is not how it works. Part-time employment is the obvious example. The Kaiser Family Foundation looked at this last year and found that only 19% of part-time workers had employer-based insurance through their job. 19%. Among full-time workers, it was 62%. And even when a part-time worker was employed somewhere that offered health insurance to somebody, plenty of them still couldn't enroll. One of the part-time workers who were ineligible for an employer plan, 84% were ineligible because they didn't work enough hours or enough weeks during the year. And that matters because under the Affordable Care Act, large employers generally face penalties if they fail to offer qualifying coverage to full-time employees. And for that purpose, full-time means averaging at least 30 hours a week. That requirement does not extend the same way to part-time workers. Now, I want to be careful. I'm not telling you that every restaurant manager in America is sitting in an office rubbing his hands together and saying, let's give Linda 29 hours so we can screw her out of health insurance. There are legitimate reasons businesses use part-time workers. Some employees want part-time schedules. Some industries depend on seasonal or variable staffing. But the result is still the result. You can have a job and you can work hard and you can show up every time you're scheduled and you can still not have employer-sponsored health care. And even if your job offers it, that does not necessarily mean it's cheap. In 2025, the average premium for employer-sponsored family coverage was approaching $27,000 a year, with workers themselves paying an average of about $6,800 toward that premium. And that's before you actually use the insurance and meet the deductible. So the next time you see somebody like Jesse Waters on television saying, you want health insurance? Get a job. Maybe somebody should ask some questions. Full-time? Part-time? Does the employer offer insurance? Am I eligible? What does the premium cost? What's the deductible? Because get a job is not healthcare policy. Get a job is a bumper sticker. And while we're talking about jobs, there's another phrase I want you to start listening for very carefully. This project will create thousands of jobs. Because we're hearing that one more and more and more around data centers. These gigantic facilities are being pitched all over the country as engines of economic development. And they certainly can create economic activity. They require enormous construction projects, electricians and pipe fitters and, heavy equipment operators and laborers and engineers and contractors. And those are all real jobs, good jobs in many cases. I'm not dismissing any of them, but listen carefully to what happens when politicians announce the number. Because sometimes the really big number is the number of people needed to build the thing, not the number needed to run the thing once it's built. Here's a perfect example from the Trump administration's own Department of Energy. In July, the Department of Energy announced a massive data center and energy development project at its Paducah site in Kentucky. More than $100 billion in private investment. And the headline employment numbers, approximately 8,000 jobs. Well, that sounds fantastic. But then keep reading. These were 8,000 construction jobs. Permanent jobs, on the other hand, 600. 8,000 during construction, 600 permanent jobs. And again, I'm not saying the 8,000 jobs don't count. If you're an electrician working that project for several years, your mortgage company is going to consider those paychecks very real. But there's a gigantic difference between this project will employ 8,000 people while we're building it, and this project is bringing 8,000 permanent jobs into your community. Those are not the same promise. Construction on that Paducah project is expected to run through 2031. After that, the permanent workforce, Department of Energy itself, is predicting to be only 600. So when you hear politicians announce some spectacular job number tied to a data center, don't immediately cheer and don't immediately boo either. Ask the next question. How many are construction jobs? How long do they last? How many are permanent jobs? And what are those jobs paying? What public subsidies are involved? What infrastructure is the community providing? What happens to electricity demand? Who gets the upside? Who gets the bill? That's not being anti-business. That's called asking what the deal actually is. And that's really what this whole section comes down to. Jobs is not a complete economic measure. A job can be temporary or part-time, and it can offer no health insurance, or it can offer insurance you can't afford. A job can pay more dollars while inflation eats the entire raise. A community can gain thousands of construction jobs and a few hundred permanent ones. So if somebody tells you the economy is working because people have jobs, ask what those jobs actually provide. And that brings us directly into healthcare, because America built an enormous part of its healthcare system around employment. Then we somehow forgot to guarantee that employment would actually come with healthcare. As I said, even if you have a job, even if you have insurance through that job, even if you're doing everything exactly the way the system tells you to do it, you can still get absolutely hammered by healthcare costs. Premiums and deductibles and copays and prescription drug prices and hospital bills and specialist bills. And the wonderful little surprise where you discover that the doctor who treated you was apparently operating in some alternate insurance universe from the hospital you were standing inside of. Now, the conservative diagnosis usually comes in a few different flavors. They'll say Obamacare screwed everything up. They'll say government interference made healthcare expensive. They'll say Medicaid is full of waste and abuse. Undocumented immigrants are using healthcare that taxpayers are paying for. And if we could just get government out of the way and let the free market work, prices would come down. And again, there are pieces of reality in there. Government policy absolutely affects healthcare prices. Medicaid and Medicare can be inefficient. Fraud exists. Undocumented immigrants do use emergency healthcare services, and those services cost money. Don't ask me about the free market, because I don't think there's any evidence that the free market lowers the cost of anything. But either way, now ask the question: how much do those things actually explain? Because I want you to picture an ordinary middle-class American. They have insurance, they go to the hospital, they get treated. And 3 weeks later, they receive a bill that looks like somebody accidentally charged them for a new wing on the building. Is the reason that bill is so high because an undocumented immigrant went to the emergency room somewhere? Or should we maybe look at how the actual healthcare industry is structured? Because one of the biggest changes in American medicine has been consolidation. Hospitals buying other hospitals. Hospital systems buying physician practices. Insurers getting bigger. Private equity firms buying into medical specialties. And when competition decreases, bargaining power shifts. The Government Accountability Office review published last year found that 47% of physicians were employed by or affiliated with hospital systems in 2024. Back in 2012, that was less than 30%. And what did the research GAO reviewed generally find? Well, when hospitals consolidate with physician practices, spending and prices often go up. The quality, usually no improvement. Sometimes it's worse. And that's an important point, because consolidation is often sold using the language of efficiency. We're integrating care, we're coordinating services, we're creating economies of scale. Okay, maybe, but if the result is that the same doctor's visit suddenly gets billed through a hospital system with greater negotiating power, efficiency becomes a pretty interesting word. GAO cited one example involving cardiac stress tests. For commercially insured patients, reimbursement for a stress test performed in a hospital outpatient setting could be about 2.5 times what it cost when performed in a lower cost physician office setting. It's the same test, but a very different price. That's not an immigrant problem. That's a market structure problem. And pharmaceutical prices are another part of this. So are specialty drugs. So are increasingly complicated layers between the company making the drug, the pharmacy benefit manager negotiating it, the insurer covering it, the employer buying the plan, and you standing at the pharmacy counter wondering why nobody can tell you what the damn thing is actually going to cost you. And this is where I want to avoid another overly easy answer, because healthcare costs are not exploding because of one cartoon villain invented them. Americans use a lot of healthcare. We have an aging population. Chronic illness is expensive. New treatments can be spectacularly effective and spectacularly expensive. Some drugs cost enormous amounts to develop. Hospitals have labor costs. Rural hospitals struggle to stay open. All of that is real. But the system we've built piles those genuine costs on top of consolidation, administration complexity, opaque pricing, and enormous negotiating disparities. And the costs are still climbing. Employer healthcare costs are projected to rise another 9.5% next year, 2027. And this will push the average employer cost above $19,000 per worker. So remember the advice from 5 minutes ago. If you want healthcare, get a job. Great. Now the employer has the job. The employee has the job. The employee has insurance, and the cost of that insurance keeps climbing anyway, because employment was never the answer to the underlying question. Why does healthcare cost so damn much? It was just a way to avoid answering it. And that's where the political conversation becomes almost surreal. We could spend days talking about whether somebody on Medicaid got something they supposedly didn't deserve, and we can rage about an undocumented immigrant receiving treatment at an emergency room, and we can turn healthcare into another culture war battlefield. Meanwhile, hospital systems consolidate, physician practices get bought, drug prices rise, premiums rise, deductibles rise, and the people making those decisions somehow receive far less cultural fury, if you will, than the people with the least power in the entire system. So no, I'm not telling you undocumented healthcare has zero cost. I'm telling you to put it in proportion. If you're an uninsured American who just opened a medical bill for $6,000, which refugee set that price? Which transgender kid negotiated your deductible? Which Medicaid recipient bought your local cardiology practice? I mean, and if we genuinely want to know why healthcare is so expensive, maybe we should stop interrogating the people standing in the waiting room and start looking at the people who own the building. Which brings us to another institution where the people standing in the room taking the blame are often the ones with remarkably little control over the problems they're being blamed for. America's teachers. Yes, American schools have real problems, serious ones: chronic absenteeism, learning loss, behavior problems, teacher shortages, burnout, parents who are frustrated, districts that are struggling, kids who are struggling, families that are stretched to the breaking point. None of those things are imaginary. But if you listen to the political right, you would think the primary threat to American education is a teacher with a rainbow sticker and a copy of Genderqueer hidden behind the math books. CRT, DEI, pronouns, transgender students, LGBTQ books, secularism, teacher unions, teachers themselves. And this is where I want to be extremely clear. I do not buy the broader argument that teachers are the problem at all. You can count me out on that one. Are there bad teachers? Of course. There are bad doctors. There are bad cops. There are bad lawyers and accountants. There are bad podcasters. No profession has a halo. Schools make bad decisions. Administrators can make bad decisions. Curriculum choices can be stupid. Parents can have legitimate complaints. Unions can defend policies I disagree with. Fine. But this idea that America's educational problems are being driven by some army of teachers who got into the profession so they could indoctrinate your children, it's total bullshit. I know too many teachers. I've heard too many stories about what they're actually dealing with. Overcrowded classrooms, kids with serious behavioral needs, kids coming to school hungry, kids coming to school exhausted, kids in unstable homes, kids who need counseling and can't get it, kids whose parents are barely holding things together financially, teachers spending their own money on classroom supplies, teachers drowning in paperwork, teachers being asked to be instructors and social workers and behavior specialists and crisis counselors and test administrators and tech support and sometimes surrogate parents before they even get to the lesson plan. Now, my knowing teachers isn't data, obviously. It's simply personal experience. So let's look at the data. The Department of Education says chronic absenteeism remains a major national problem. The latest federal figure it cites shows about 28% of students were chronically absent in the 22-23 school year. That means missing at least 10% of the school year. More than 1 out of every 4 students. And what does the Department of Education identify as major causes? Things like health challenges, transportation problems, family responsibilities, housing instability, school disengagement, lack of support. In other words, not pronouns, not DEI, not a transgender kid using the bathroom, not a teacher secretly trying to overthrow Western civilization. And if a child is missing a month of school over the course of a year, that is going to show up somewhere. Reading, math, behavior, graduation rates, everything. We also know schools are still dealing with staffing problems. The federal teacher shortage data shows shortages across multiple subject areas and states, including special education and math and science and foreign languages and other fields. So when people say schools are struggling, I agree. But look at what teachers are being asked to manage. They did not create the housing crisis that makes students bounce from one address to another. They didn't set food prices. They don't decide whether a family has health insurance. They didn't create the mental health crisis. They didn't create the pandemic learning disruption. They do not decide how many counselors a district can afford. They don't decide whether there are enough special education aides. And they certainly cannot teach a kid who is not physically in the building. Very often, teachers are not causing the underlying problems. They are standing at the end of the pipeline when all of these problems arrive in one classroom at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. And then politics comes along and says, you know what the real issue is? The pronouns. I mean, come on. This is where the opportunity cost of the culture war matters. A state legislature can spend months arguing about which books need to be pulled from shelves. School boards spend meeting after meeting after meeting fighting over bathroom policies. Politicians campaign on stopping woke indoctrination. And meanwhile, you've got a district where a quarter of the kids are chronically absent. You've got teachers quitting. You've got families who can't find childcare. You've got parents working 2 jobs. You've got kids with untreated mental health needs. You've got classrooms where one teacher is trying to meet 25 completely different needs at the same time. And the political system gets rewarded for talking about the thing that produces the angriest television segment instead of the thing that might actually improve the school. That doesn't mean cultural questions never matter. Parents absolutely get a say in what schools teach. Age appropriateness matters, transparency matters, curriculum matters, but proportion matters too. If your school has a reading crisis, an absenteeism crisis, a staffing crisis, and a behavior crisis, and the centerpiece of your political response is banning rainbow flags, you are not solving the problem. You're choosing the fight that's easiest to sell. And that is the pattern I want you to keep noticing. The real problem is hard. The convenient villain is easy. And nowhere is that more politically useful than when the problem is fear itself, because next we have to look at crime. And before somebody starts yelling at their radio or their phone or whatever, let me get something out of the way. Crime matters. If somebody murders your husband, assaults your daughter, breaks into your house, or carjacks you at gunpoint, you do not give a shit that the crime rate nationally has declined last year. You were victimized. Your family was hurt. Your neighborhood may genuinely have a crime problem. Statistics don't erase any of that. However, statistics do tell us whether the story we're being told about America as a whole is true. And right now, that story and the numbers are miles apart. The FBI released its final 2025 crime statistics just a little over a week ago. Violent crime fell 9.3% from 2024. Murder rates fell 18.1%. Robbery fell 18.5%. Property crime fell too. And the national murder rate fell from 4.1 per 100,000 people, tied with 1955 and 56 for the lowest rate in the FBI's historical series. Let me say that again because it is pretty difficult to square with the nightly political apocalypse. The murder rate in 2025 was tied for the lowest rate in 70 years. Now, that doesn't mean crime is solved. It doesn't mean every city got safer. It doesn't mean your neighborhood got safer. National averages can fall while a particular city or a particular block gets worse. But you cannot honestly describe America as being consumed by some unprecedented national crime wave when violent crime just experienced the largest year-over-year decline since the FBI began producing national estimates in 1936. Those things cannot both be true. And then we get to immigration, of course, because if you spend enough time watching conservative media, you could come away thinking that the border is essentially a conveyor belt carrying violent criminals directly into your neighborhood. And let's establish the obvious first. Immigrants commit crimes. Undocumented immigrants commit crimes. Some of those crimes can be horrific. If somebody enters this country illegally and murders somebody, prosecute them, lock them up. And if after that they're legally subject to deportation, then deport them. I have no ideological difficulty with saying any of that. What I have a problem with is taking one horrific crime committed by one immigrant and using it as evidence about millions of other people. Because that's not analysis. That's just an anecdote. So what happens when we zoom out? The best available research does not support the idea that immigrants as a group are usually crime prone. One major national study examining incarceration over 150 years found that immigrants today are substantially less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born Americans. That pattern isn't some brand new phenomenon either. Immigrants have generally had lower incarceration rates for generations. Now, incarceration rates are not a perfect synonym for crime rates. different groups can have different interactions with law enforcement and prosecution and sentencing and deportation. So don't take that statistic farther than it goes, but it certainly doesn't support the picture of immigration as some giant national crime wave. And this is where politics has an enormous advantage over statistics. Statistics are boring. And, a 9.3% decline in violent crime, that's a chart. A horrifying murder committed by an undocumented immigrant, well, that's a face and a victim and a grieving family and shots of police tape and a mugshot. And human beings respond to stories much more viscerally than they respond to spreadsheets. Politicians are well aware of that. Television producers too. Social media algorithms sure as hell know that. So one terrible case can become the story of immigration. Meanwhile, millions of immigrants go to work and take their kids to school and buy groceries and come home and watch television and go to bed without committing a felony. But there's no chyron for that. Breaking news, guy went to work again today. Not much of a segment. And notice what happens. A real concern, public safety, gets connected to a culturally powerful villain. And then the individual case starts doing the work of the national data. And pretty soon you've moved from this person committed a terrible crime to these people are making America dangerous. Those are completely different claims. The first one may be unquestionably true. The second one would require a good bit of evidence. And if the evidence says violent crime is plunging nationally, while immigrants are not more crime prone than native-born Americans, then maybe the political story deserves a little more skepticism. That's the pattern. Again, real fear, real victims, real crimes, but then a diagnosis that grows far beyond what the evidence is able to carry. And after 6 different problems, I think now we're finally in a position to ask the question underneath this entire episode. Because have you noticed something about the people who keep getting blamed? They have one remarkable thing in common. Very few of them actually have much power at all. So let's put the pieces on the table. Housing, wages, jobs, healthcare, schools, crime. Real problems, real frustrations, and now look at the people who keep showing up as the explanation. Immigrants, trans people, Muslims, gay people, SNAP recipients, Medicaid recipients, teachers, college students, women getting abortions. And I want you to notice something. Most of these people don't set prices. They don't write tax law. They don't negotiate hospital contracts. They don't decide whether your factory moves to China. They do not determine whether your employer offers you health insurance. They do not decide how many houses get built in your town. They have no control whether a hospital buys every independent medical practice in the county. They have no say in whether a data center developer gets a tax break. They don't decide whether productivity gains go to workers, executives, dividends, or stock buybacks. They are certainly capable of affecting the world around them. Everyone is. But the amount of power they possess is nowhere near the amount of blame that they're being asked to carry. And this is where I want to be careful about something. I'm not telling you that there is some secret conference room where 12 billion millionaires and Elon Musk and the Heritage Foundation and the CEO of United Healthcare meet every Tuesday and decide, okay, this week everybody blame transgender people. I mean, that's cartoonish. It doesn't need to work that way. Politics is much simpler than that. Politicians figure out what gets people angry. Cable television figures out the same thing. What keeps people watching. Political organizations figure out what raises money. Social media platforms figure out what keeps you scrolling. Businesses figure out what policies protect their interest. And when those incentives line up, nobody has to give the order. The machine runs just fine on its own because culture war politics has one enormous advantage over economic reform. It gives you villains you can see, whether it be a migrant crossing the border, a transgender teen, a teacher at a school board meeting, a protester on a college campus, a woman walking into a clinic. Those are all people, and they have faces, and they make good television. Market concentration, not much of a visual. Regulatory capture, try putting that on a campaign hat. Hospital consolidation, nothing gets the crowd on its feet like a 15-minute PowerPoint on vertical integration in healthcare. So instead, politics gives you a villain. And once you have the villain, you don't have to explain the system. That's the trick. Your hospital bill is insane. Look at the immigrant. Your kid can't afford a house. Look at the immigrant. Your school is struggling. Those damn teachers. Your community feels different than it did 20 years ago. Oh, well, those Muslim families did that. Your paycheck doesn't stretch. It's all these SNAP recipients. You feel like the country is changing too fast. Well, these damn trans kids. And while you're looking over there, who's writing the legislation and who's hiring the lobbyists and who's financing the campaigns and buying the competitors and getting the tax preferences and negotiating the merger and deciding whether the plant stays open, who's setting the compensation structure, who's determining whether that new development produces thousands of permanent jobs or just a few hundred, who actually has the ability to change the system that we're talking about. Those are much harder questions, but they're better questions. And sometimes the answer is going to be government. Sometimes it's going to be a corporation. Sometimes it's going to be voters protecting their own interests. Sometimes it's going to be a union. Sometimes it's going to be decades of bad policy that nobody deliberately designed to produce the mess we have now. Sometimes there may not even be an obvious winner, because not every bad outcome was engineered by somebody. Some systems just evolve into arrangements that are lousy for a lot of people and very difficult to unwind. But if you want a serious politics, you have to trace the cause. You have to identify the mechanism. You have to ask who had the power. Because otherwise, you're not solving anything. You're just assigning blame. And if the person you're blaming has less money than you and less influence than you and less political access than you and virtually no ability to change the thing you're pissed off about, maybe they're not the one that you should be looking at. Maybe they're not the end of the investigation. Maybe they're where somebody else wanted you to look. I said at the beginning that I was not going to spend this episode telling angry Americans that they have nothing to be angry about. And I hope I've made that clear. Things are wrong. Housing is too expensive. Healthcare costs too much. Too many jobs fail to provide security. Too many people work hard and still feel like they're standing still. Schools are carrying burdens they were never designed to carry alone. Government can be wasteful. Institutions can fail. Companies can abuse power. Bad regulations exist. Bad deregulation exists. Immigration can create pressures. Globalization can hurt communities. Local governments can screw things up. None of this requires pretending that every progressive explanation is right and every conservative explanation is insane. The reality check is about proportion, causation, power. Because if somebody tells you your life is harder because the person who has less money than you and less political power than you and less access than you and less ability to affect the system, you need to ask one more question. Who gains by having me believe that? Maybe the answer is nobody. Maybe it's just a bad explanation. But sometimes if you keep asking, you start finding people who are very, very happy that your attention stopped where it did. The lie isn't that you're hurting. The pain is real and the frustration and the fear are real. The lie is who you've been told to blame. So don't stop at the immigrant or the teacher or the trans kid or the family on SNAP. Keep going. Past the politician, past the talking head, past the lobbyist, past the corporation and the campaign donor. Follow the evidence, follow the incentives, follow the money, follow the power. And when you finally get to the person or institution that actually had the ability to make the decision you're angry about, that's where accountability belongs. All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. If you found this episode useful, share it with somebody who might disagree with it. Seriously, I mean it, because I'm not especially interested in preaching just to people who already agree with most of what I say. The whole point of reality check is to check the diagnosis, not just the team jersey. So I will be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. Between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.